Good evening, and welcome to another collection of tales meant for the quiet hours. Tonight, I have something a little different for you. These are stories that exist in that strange space between wakefulness and sleep. Tales that will carry you gently into the darkness while your mind drifts toward rest. I hope you find comfort in these whispered horrors, because there's something oddly soothing about being scared when you're safe in your own bed. So settle in, get comfortable, and let the night embrace you as we begin our first story. The old Victorian house on Maple Street had been empty for 3 years when Sarah finally decided to rent it. The price was too good to pass up, even though the landlord seemed almost relieved when she signed the lease. He handed over the keys with shaking hands, and muttered something about hoping she'd have better luck than the previous tenants. Sarah didn't think much of it at the time. Old houses came with old stories, and she'd always been practical about such things. The first few weeks were peaceful. Sarah spent her evenings unpacking boxes and arranging furniture in rooms that seemed to hold their breath whenever she entered. The house was beautiful in its own way, with tall windows that caught the afternoon light and hardwood floors that creaked pleasantly under her feet. She particularly loved the library on the second floor, with its built-in shelves and the reading chair positioned perfectly near the window. It was in that chair, 3 weeks after moving in, that Sarah first heard the piano. The sound drifted up from downstairs, soft and melancholy. Someone was playing Chopin, she thought, though she couldn't place the specific piece. The notes seemed to float through the floorboards, each one clear and deliberate. Sarah set down her book and listened, wondering if perhaps sound was carrying from a neighbor's house. But as she concentrated, she realized the music was definitely coming from within her own walls. She made her way downstairs, following the haunting melody. The music grew louder as she approached the front parlor, where an old upright piano sat against the far wall. The previous tenants had left it behind, along with several other pieces of furniture. Sarah had been meaning to have it tuned, thinking she might take up playing again after so many years. But as she reached the parlor doorway, the music stopped. The piano bench sat empty, its worn velvet cushion undisturbed. Sarah approached the instrument and lifted the fallboard, revealing keys that looked as though they hadn't been touched in months. A thin layer of dust had settled across the black keys, and when she pressed middle C, the note rang out flat and hollow, nothing like the pure tones she'd heard moments before. That night, Sarah lay in bed, listening to the house settle around her. Every creak and whisper seemed amplified in the darkness, but she told herself it was just the natural sounds of an old building adjusting to temperature changes. She'd almost drifted off to sleep when the piano began again. This time, the music was different, still classical, still beautiful, but with an urgency that hadn't been there before. The notes seemed to climb and fall with increasing intensity, as though the invisible pianist was pouring their soul into each phrase. Sarah found herself sitting up in bed, drawn to the melody, despite the impossibility of its source. She wrapped her robe around herself and padded barefoot down the stairs. The music continued as she moved through the darkened house, guided by the pale moonlight filtering through the windows. When she reached the parlor, she stopped in the doorway and watched as the piano keys moved by themselves, depressing and releasing in perfect rhythm with the haunting song that filled the air. There was no one there. The bench remained empty, yet the music played on, each note struck with the precision of a master pianist. Sarah stood transfixed, no longer frightened, but somehow deeply moved by the performance. The piece seemed familiar, like a half-remembered lullaby from childhood, though she was certain she'd never heard it before. As the final notes faded into silence, Sarah whispered, "That was beautiful." The keys stopped moving, and for a moment the house held its breath. Then, slowly, deliberately, the piano began a new song. This one was gentler, softer, like a musical response to her compliment. Sarah found herself smiling as she listened, and when the song ended, she said, "Thank you." From that night forward, the piano played regularly. Sometimes Sarah would wake to find music drifting through the house in the early morning hours. Other times, she'd return from work to discover that someone had been playing while she was away, the lingering vibrations still hanging in the air. She began leaving small offerings on top of the piano: a cup of tea that would be empty by morning, fresh flowers that seemed to perk up when the music played, sheet music she'd bought at the local music store. The invisible pianist seemed to appreciate these gestures. The music became more varied, ranging from classical pieces to popular songs from decades past. Sarah started to recognize patterns in the performances, certain pieces that seemed to correspond to her moods. When she'd had a difficult day at work, she'd return home to find gentle, comforting melodies waiting for her. On weekends, when she felt particularly happy, the music would be lively and celebratory. Months passed, and Sarah found herself looking forward to these musical conversations. She would sit in the parlor during the evening concerts, sometimes reading, sometimes just listening with her eyes closed. The presence in her house felt warm and companionable, like sharing space with a dear friend who happened to be invisible. One evening in early autumn, as rain drummed against the windows and Sarah sat curled in her favorite chair, the piano began playing something she'd never heard before. The melody was achingly beautiful, filled with longing and sadness that seemed to reach directly into her heart. As the song progressed, Sarah found tears streaming down her cheeks, though she couldn't say exactly why. When the music ended, Sarah whispered, "Who are you?" The house fell silent for a long moment. Then, very slowly, the piano began to spell out letters on the keys. Each note corresponded to a letter of the alphabet, and Sarah grabbed a piece of paper to write them down as they were played. "M-A-R-G-A-R-E-T, the piano spelled out. "Margaret," Sarah repeated softly. "That's a lovely name." The piano played a brief, happy trill in response. Over the following weeks, Sarah learned more about her invisible housemate. Margaret had lived in the house many years ago, she gathered from their musical conversations. She had been a pianist, clearly a talented one, who had died young. The details remained unclear, but Sarah sensed a story of love cut short, dreams unfulfilled, a life that had ended before its time. Margaret seemed to enjoy having someone to play for again. The concerts became more elaborate, sometimes lasting for hours. Sarah would make dinner while listening to sonatas, do her reading accompanied by nocturnes, and fall asleep to gentle lullabies that seemed designed to chase away nightmares. But as winter approached, something began to change. The music took on a different quality, becoming more insistent, more urgent. Margaret seemed to be trying to communicate something important, but Sarah couldn't understand what it was. The melodies grew more complex, sometimes discordant, as though frustration was bleeding into the performance. Then, one November evening, the music stopped entirely. Sarah waited in the parlor, wondering if perhaps Margaret was simply taking a break. But hours passed in silence, and eventually Sarah went to bed, feeling strangely bereft. The next day brought more silence, and the day after that. The house felt empty in a way it hadn't since Sarah first moved in, as though something essential had been removed from its very foundation. A week passed without a single note from the piano. Sarah began to worry that she'd somehow offended her ghostly companion, though she couldn't imagine how. She left longer notes on the piano, asking if Margaret was all right, pleading for some sign that she was still there. But the instrument remained silent, gathering dust once again. It was on the 8th night of silence that Sarah discovered what Margaret had been trying to tell her. Sarah had been lying awake for hours, listening to the oppressive quiet that had settled over the house like a heavy blanket. The absence of Margaret's music felt wrong, as though the very soul of the building had been extracted. Unable to bear the silence any longer, she rose from bed and made her way downstairs to the parlor. The piano sat in its usual place, but something was different. In the moonlight streaming through the tall windows, Sarah could see that the fallboard was open, revealing the keys she was certain she had closed before going to bed. As she approached, she noticed something else that made her breath catch in her throat. There were papers scattered across the piano bench and the floor around it. Sheet music, but not the kind she had left for Margaret. These pages looked old, yellowed with age, and covered in handwritten notes and corrections. Sarah gathered them carefully, squinting in the dim light to make out the faded ink. The top page bore a title in elegant script, Sonata for the Lost by Margaret Whitmore. Below it, in the same careful handwriting, was a date from 1952 and the words, "For my dearest James, who promised to return." Sarah's hands trembled as she shuffled through the pages. Here was an entire composition, complex and beautiful, even in its written form. She could almost hear how it would sound, could imagine Margaret's fingers dancing across the keys as she poured her heart into every measure. But there was something else tucked between the pages that made Sarah's chest tighten with sudden understanding. It was a letter, the paper so fragile it seemed it might crumble at her touch. The envelope was addressed to Margaret Whitmore in a masculine hand, and the return address showed it had been sent from somewhere overseas. Sarah hesitated for a moment, feeling like an intruder, but something about the way the letter had been placed seemed deliberate, as though Margaret wanted her to read it. The letter was brief, dated just a few months after the sonata. "My dearest Margaret," it began, "I know I promised to return for our wedding, but circumstances have changed. I have met someone here, and I find that my feelings have shifted in ways I never expected. Please forgive me for not having the courage to tell you this in person. I hope you will find happiness with someone more deserving of your love. James." Sarah sank into the chair beside the piano, clutching the letter and the sheet music. Now she understood Margaret's urgency, the increasing desperation in her performances. She had been trying to share her story, to finally reveal the pain she had carried for decades. The music had been her voice, and the silence that followed had been her grief made manifest. But there was still more to discover. As Sarah sat in the moonlit parlor, surrounded by Margaret's compositions, she began to notice other details she had missed before. The wallpaper in this room was different from the rest of the house, more faded, as though it had absorbed years of sorrow. The floorboards near the piano were worn smooth in a pattern that suggested someone had paced there countless times, walking the same path over and over in distress. And there, barely visible in the pale light, Sarah saw something that made her heart break completely. Carved into the window frame beside the piano, so faint it was almost invisible, were two sets of initials surrounded by a heart. M.W. plus J.H. forever. Margaret had waited. Even after receiving that cruel letter, she had continued to wait, composing music for a love that would never return, playing songs for ears that would never hear them. She had died in this house, Sarah realized, probably alone, still hoping against hope that James would change his mind and come back to her. The weight of this revelation settled over Sarah like a shroud. She understood now why the previous tenants had left, why the landlord had been so eager to rent the house. Margaret's presence wasn't malevolent, but her sorrow was so profound it had seeped into the very walls, creating an atmosphere of melancholy that few could bear for long. But Sarah didn't want to leave. If anything, she felt more connected to her invisible housemate than ever before. Margaret had trusted her with her story, had finally found someone willing to listen to her pain without running away. The least Sarah could do was stay and bear witness to her tragedy. "I'm so sorry," Sarah whispered to the empty room. "I'm sorry he hurt you. I'm sorry you waited so long, but you don't have to wait anymore, Margaret. You don't have to carry this alone." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, one key on the piano depressed by itself, producing a single, pure note that hung in the air like a question. Sarah wiped the tears from her cheeks and placed Margaret's sheet music on the piano's music stand. "Would you play it for me?" she asked. "Your sonata? I'd like to hear it." The piano was silent for several heartbeats. Then, with infinite gentleness, the keys began to move. But instead of the composition before them, Margaret played something else entirely. It was the lullaby that had become so familiar to Sarah, the one that had helped her fall asleep on countless nights. But now she could hear the sadness woven through its gentle melody, the longing that had shaped every note. As the lullaby concluded, Margaret began her sonata. The music that filled the parlor was unlike anything Sarah had ever heard. It was pain transformed into beauty, heartbreak elevated to art. The melodies soared and plunged, telling the story of a love that had promised everything and delivered nothing, of dreams that had withered while their dreamer waited faithfully for a resurrection that would never come. Sarah closed her eyes and let the music wash over her. She could feel Margaret's presence more strongly now, no longer just a whisper in the walls, but a fully realized spirit sharing her deepest creation. The sonata built to a crescendo that seemed to shake the very foundation of the house, then gradually settled into a resolution that spoke of acceptance, of a peace finally found after decades of waiting. When the final notes faded away, Sarah opened her eyes to find that dawn was breaking outside the windows. She had been listening for hours, completely lost in Margaret's musical narrative. But something was different now. The oppressive sadness that had hung over the house like a fog seemed to have lifted, replaced by something lighter, more hopeful. "Thank you," Sarah said softly. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." The piano played a gentle chord in response, and Sarah could swear she felt a presence beside her, warm and grateful. Margaret was still there, but the desperate urgency was gone. She had finally been heard, finally been understood, and that seemed to be enough. From that morning forward, the music in the house changed entirely. Margaret still played, but her performances were no longer filled with longing and desperation. Instead, they were celebrations of beauty for its own sake, explorations of melody and harmony that seemed to come from a place of contentment rather than sorrow. She played for Sarah in the evenings, accompanied her morning routine with gentle melodies, and filled the house with music that spoke of joy rather than loss. The relationship between Sarah and Margaret evolved into something neither of them had expected. What had begun as a haunting became a friendship, and what had been a source of fear for previous tenants transformed into a source of comfort and companionship. Sarah found herself talking to Margaret throughout the day, sharing stories about her work, her dreams, her own heartbreaks and triumphs. Margaret would respond through music, her invisible fingers finding melodies that perfectly captured the emotions Sarah was feeling. Winter deepened around the old Victorian house, but inside, warmth seemed to radiate from every room. Sarah decorated for the holidays, hanging garlands and placing candles in the windows. On Christmas Eve, she came home to find that Margaret had learned every carol she could think of, playing them in elaborate arrangements that would have impressed any concert hall audience. Sarah sang along, her voice blending with the piano in harmonies that filled the house with more joy than it had known in decades. But it was during the long January nights that Sarah began to notice something troubling. Margaret's playing, while still beautiful, seemed to be growing fainter. The notes didn't ring as clearly as they once had, and sometimes entire passages would fade in and out, as though the invisible pianist was struggling to maintain her connection to the physical world. Sarah mentioned this during one of their evening conversations, asking if Margaret was feeling unwell, though she wasn't sure how that concept applied to someone who had been dead for 70 years. Margaret's response was a melody Sarah had never heard before, something that seemed to speak of gratitude mixed with a gentle sadness. It was a farewell song, Sarah realized with growing alarm. Margaret was trying to tell her something important, something that Sarah wasn't ready to hear. Over the following weeks, the pattern became more pronounced. Some evenings, Margaret would play with all her usual skill and passion, filling the house with music that seemed to make the very air sparkle with beauty. But other nights, the piano would fall silent for hours at a time, and when the music did return, it was fragmented, uncertain, as though Margaret was having difficulty remembering how to make her presence known. Sarah began spending more time in the parlor, reading by lamplight while Margaret played, trying to anchor her ghostly friend with her attention and companionship. She sensed that Margaret was fighting against something, struggling to maintain her hold on the world she had inhabited for so long. The thought of losing her filled Sarah with a grief she hadn't expected. Margaret had become more than just a mysterious presence in her house. She had become family. One February evening, as snow fell heavily outside the tall windows, Margaret began playing something that made Sarah's blood run cold. It was her sonata again, the one she had composed for James all those years ago, but this time it sounded different. The notes were clearer than they had been in weeks, ringing with a purity and power that seemed to shake dust from the chandelier overhead. But there was something final about the performance, something that spoke of endings rather than beginnings. Sarah set down her book and moved closer to the piano, watching the keys dance under invisible fingers. Margaret was pouring everything she had into this performance, every ounce of her remaining energy focused on creating one last perfect moment of music. The sonata built to its familiar crescendo, but this time when it reached that peak, something extraordinary happened. For just an instant, Sarah thought she saw her, a young woman in a white dress, seated at the piano bench, her fingers flying across the keys with passionate intensity. Her dark hair was pinned back in the style of the 1950s, and her face was radiant with the joy of creation. She was beautiful, Sarah realized, not just in appearance but in the pure love she brought to her music. This was Margaret, as she had been in life, before heartbreak and waiting had worn her spirit thin. The vision lasted only a moment before fading back into invisibility, but the music continued. Margaret played her sonata through to its conclusion, every note perfect, every phrase filled with the emotion that had birthed it decades ago. When the final chord faded away, the silence that followed was different from any that had come before. It wasn't the absence of sound, it was the presence of completion. Sarah waited, hoping for some sign that Margaret was still there, still listening. But the piano remained silent, and the air in the parlor felt different somehow, lighter but also emptier. Margaret had said goodbye in the only language she truly knew, and now she was gone. The next morning brought a profound quiet to the house. Sarah moved through her daily routine, but everything felt different without the possibility of Margaret's music floating through the rooms. She found herself pausing outside the parlor, listening for notes that didn't come, waiting for melodies that would never again fill the silence. Days passed without a single sound from the piano. Sarah tried playing it herself, but her amateur skills produced only flat, lifeless notes that seemed to emphasize Margaret's absence rather than honor her memory. The sheet music still sat on the piano stand where Sarah had placed it that night months ago, the pages now seeming fragile and precious, the only physical evidence of Margaret's talent and pain. But Margaret had left Sarah with more than just memories and sheet music. The house itself felt different now, as though Margaret's final performance had somehow cleansed it of the lingering sorrow that had clung to its walls for so many years. The oppressive atmosphere that had driven away previous tenants was gone, replaced by something peaceful and welcoming. Margaret had found her resolution at last, and in doing so she had transformed her earthly prison into a place of beauty and rest. Sarah began to understand that Margaret's departure wasn't truly an ending, but rather a graduation. She had spent decades trapped by her own grief, unable to move forward, while James's betrayal kept her anchored to a pain that could never be resolved. But through sharing her story with Sarah, through finally having someone witness and acknowledge her suffering, Margaret had found the peace that had eluded her for so long. Spring came early that year, and Sarah found herself drawn to work in the garden behind the house. As she planted flowers and pruned the overgrown bushes, she discovered something that made her smile through her tears. Hidden beneath decades of neglect was a small memorial garden, carefully designed and lovingly maintained until Margaret's death. At its center stood a stone bench, and carved into its surface was a simple inscription: "For all the music that lives forever in our hearts." Sarah spent her evenings that spring sitting on that bench, watching the flowers bloom and listening to the natural music of wind through leaves and birds calling to their mates. Sometimes she would bring Margaret's sheet music outside and read through the compositions, hearing them in her mind even though no piano was there to play them. The garden became her new parlor, a place where she could feel Margaret's presence not as a ghost, but as a gentle memory woven into the very fabric of the place she had loved. As summer approached, Sarah made a decision that felt both necessary and right. She arranged for a local pianist to come to the house, a young woman about the age Margaret had been when she died. Together, they spent an afternoon playing through Margaret's compositions, bringing them to life once more in the parlor where they had been born. The pianist was amazed by the quality of the work, the sophisticated harmonies and emotional depth that spoke of genuine talent cut short too soon. She asked if she could make copies of the sheet music, perhaps perform some of the pieces in her upcoming recital. Sarah agreed immediately, knowing that Margaret would have been thrilled to have her music shared with the world at last. That evening, after the pianist had gone, Sarah sat alone in the parlor one final time. The piano was silent, but the room no longer felt empty. It felt complete, filled with the echoes of all the music that had been played there, all the emotions that had been poured into its atmosphere over the decades. "Thank you, Margaret," Sarah whispered to the quiet air. "Thank you for sharing your gift with me. Thank you for trusting me with your story. I promise your music will live on." For just a moment, Sarah could have sworn she felt a gentle touch on her shoulder, warm and grateful. Then the sensation faded, leaving behind only peace and the certain knowledge that some connections transcend the boundaries between life and death, between presence and memory, between sorrow and joy. The old Victorian house on Maple Street had finally found its rest, and so had the woman who had made it beautiful with her music. Margaret's songs would echo through other halls now, bringing joy to audiences who would never know the pain that had inspired them. Her story of love and loss, of waiting and acceptance, would continue through Sarah's memories and through the melodies that had survived long after their creator had found her peace. Long after their creator had found her peace. The autumn wind rattled the windows of the old farmhouse as Emma finally finished unpacking the last of her grandmother's belongings. She had inherited the property after her grandmother's passing 6 months ago, and only now had she found the courage to sort through decades of accumulated memories. The house felt different without Grandmother Rose's warm presence, hollow in ways that had nothing to do with the empty rooms. Emma had always loved visiting this place as a child. The farmhouse sat on 30 acres of rolling hills, far enough from town that the night sky blazed with stars you couldn't see anywhere else. Her grandmother had been a storyteller, filling long summer evenings with tales that danced between truth and imagination. But now, surrounded by boxes of photographs and handwritten recipes, Emma felt the weight of being the last keeper of these family stories. It was while cleaning out the attic that she found the journal. The leather-bound book was tucked away in a wooden chest beneath layers of quilts and winter coats. The cover was worn smooth by countless hands, and when Emma opened it, she discovered pages filled with her grandmother's careful handwriting. The first entry was dated 50 years ago, just after Rose had married Emma's grandfather and moved to the farm. Emma settled cross-legged on the dusty attic floor and began to read. The early entries were mundane observations about farm life, weather patterns, and the challenges of adapting to rural living after growing up in the city. But as Emma turned the pages, the tone began to shift. Her grandmother started writing about sounds she heard at night, footsteps in the hallway when everyone else was asleep, doors that opened by themselves. At first, Rose had blamed these incidents on the house settling or the wind. Old farmhouses were full of mysterious noises after all. But the entries grew more detailed, describing encounters that couldn't be explained away by natural causes. Rose wrote about finding the kitchen chairs arranged in a perfect circle each morning, about hearing conversations in rooms she knew were empty, about feeling watched by unseen eyes. Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty attic. She remembered her grandmother mentioning strange occurrences during their visits, but Emma had always assumed they were just stories meant to entertain a curious child. Now, reading these private thoughts, she realized her grandmother had been documenting something real. The journal entries spanned decades, creating a timeline of supernatural activity that seemed to ebb and flow like tides. Some years brought frequent encounters, while others passed quietly with only occasional unexplained incidents. Rose wrote about learning to coexist with whatever shared the farmhouse, treating the invisible presence with the same courtesy she would show any house guest. But it was the final entries, written just weeks before Rose's death, that made Emma's hands tremble. Her grandmother's handwriting had grown shaky with age, but her words were clear and urgent. She wrote about sensing a change in the atmosphere, a growing restlessness among the spirits that had long dwelled peacefully in the old house. Something was stirring them up, making them more active and more visible than they had been in years. The last entry was the most disturbing of all. Rose described waking to find her bedroom filled with figures from different eras, all of them watching her with expressions of desperate need. Men in work clothes from the early 1900s, women in dresses that spoke of harder times, children whose faces held wisdom beyond their years. They weren't threatening, she wrote, but they were trying to communicate something important, something she couldn't quite understand before her illness made concentration difficult. Emma closed the journal and sat in the gathering darkness of the attic, processing what she had read. Her rational mind wanted to dismiss the entries as the products of an aging woman's imagination, but something deep in her gut told her otherwise. Rose had been sharp until the very end, her memory intact even as her body failed. These weren't the confused ramblings of dementia. They were the careful observations of someone who had lived with mystery for 50 years. As if summoned by her thoughts, Emma heard footsteps on the stairs below, and so our tales draw to a close for another evening. The darkness has wrapped itself around us like an old familiar blanket, and perhaps by now your eyelids are growing heavy with the weight of these whispered stories. Sarah found her peace with Margaret's music, and Emma stands at the threshold of her own mysterious inheritance, ready to discover what secrets the old farmhouse holds. These stories remind us that not all hauntings are born of malice. Sometimes the spirits that walk among us are simply lost souls seeking understanding, connection, or the chance to finally rest. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world feels thin and possibilities endless, we might find that fear and comfort can exist side by side. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with gentle melodies rather than restless footsteps. Until we meet again in the darkness, good night.